The Roswell incident. It was a warm evening in early July 1947, and the desert air around Roswell, New Mexico was still. The sun had just slipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the barren plains. Little did anyone know that this small, quiet town, primarily known for its cattle ranches and military air base, was about to become ground zero for one of the greatest mysteries of the 20th century. Our story begins on the sprawling Foster Ranch owned by a simple farmer named Mac Brazel had spent most of his life tending to the land, familiar with the rhythms of nature. He knew the sky, the wind, and the sounds of the desert. But on that fateful evening, something changed as he rode out to check his fields. He noticed something strange shimmering in the twilight, something that definitely didn't belong there. Scattered across the pasture was an unusual debris field, metallic fragments, shiny and lightweight, strewn about in every direction. Brazel dismounted his horse and cautiously approached. The material was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was thin and flexible, yet incredibly strong. As he lifted a piece, it seemed to crumple easily in his hand. But when he let go, it sapped back to its original shape. There were no scorch marks, no signs of fire. Yet it was clear something had crashed. This discovery bewildered Brazel, but being a practical man, he gathered up a few pieces of the debris, loaded them into his truck, and headed into Roswell to report what he had found. At first he approached Sheriff George Wilcox, who listened to Brazel's tale with growing interest. Wilcox, equally perplexed, decided to escalate the matter, contacting the nearby Roswell Army Airfield RAF, which was home to the 59th Bomb Group, the only unit at the time with atomic capabilities. The RAP sent Major Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, to investigate the mysterious wreckage. Marcel, a seasoned officer who had dealt with classified materials, arrived at the ranch the next day, accompanied by another officer, Captain Sheridan Cavett. The two men spent hours examining the wreckage. Gathering as much of it as they could, Marcel would later describe the material as unlike anything he had ever encountered, saying it seemed to be a type of metal that was nearly weightless yet indestructible. What was even more curious was the presence of strange symbols, which some would later describe as hieroglyphic, like markings on certain pieces of the debris. Marcel took the wreckage back to the airbase for further analysis, and the story might have ended there if it weren't for the military's next move on July 8, 1947. The RAV's public information officer, Lieutenant Walter H., issued a press release that would send shockwaves around the world. The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday, when the intelligence office of the 59th Bomb Group of the ETH Air Force Roswell Army Airfield was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc. The local newspaper, the Roswell Daily Record, ran the headline, "Raya captures flying sorcerer on ranch in Roswell region." For a brief moment, it seemed as if the U.S. military was confirming that something truly extraordinary had occurred. The idea of a flying disc sent imaginations into overdrive. It was the dawn of the UFO era, and people were hungry for answers. But just as quickly as the story broke, it was retracted the very next day in a bizarre about-face. The military held a press conference presenting an entirely different narrative. This time, it was Brigadier General Roger Rye, the commanding officer of the ETH Air Force, who addressed the media. He displayed what he claimed was the actual debris from the crash site, a tattered weather balloon made of rubber and foil. Marcel, the officer who had initially inspected the debris, was present at the press conference, now sheepishly standing by the new explanation. The official line was clear. There was no flying saucer, no alien craft. What had crashed on Brazel's ranch was merely a weather balloon from a top-secret project called Project Mogul. This project, as the government explained, involved high-altitude balloons equipped with sensitive microphones designed to detect sound waves from Soviet nuclear tests. The hieroglyphs and strange materials were simply components of this advanced balloon technology. For many, that seemed to be the end of the story. The government's explanation was logical, and in the wake of World War II, in the rising tensions of the Cold War, it was not unusual for military operations to remain classified. Yet for others, the sudden shift in the narrative was suspicious. Why had the military first reported a flying saucer only to retract it so quickly? And why were the descriptions of the debris from witnesses so drastically different from what the military eventually presented over the years? More questions began to surface. Eyewitnesses, including those who had been at the crash site and others who had worked at the Roswell base, started to come forward was far more significant than a weather balloon. Some of these accounts came decades later, but they painted a picture of a much larger, more disturbing event. One of the most compelling testimonies came from Major Jesse Marcel himself. In the late 1970s, Marcel broke his silence in interviews with UFO researchers. He expressed deep regret for not standing by his initial assessment, stating that the debris he saw was not from any known earthly technology. Marcel's statements reignited public interest in Roswell, turning it from a footnote in UFO law into the centerpiece of conspiracy theories about government cover-ups and extraterrestrial encounters. Then came stories of a second crash site, one that had allegedly been kept even more secret. According to these accounts, the debris field that Brazel found was only part of the story. Some witnesses claimed that a second Moore-Int craft had been discovered miles away, and that inside there were bodies, small humanoid figures that bore no resemblance to humans. These beings, many said, were transported to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio for study. As the years pass, the Roswell incident became a touchstone for UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists alike. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and every new witness or revelation seemed to add LERS to the mystery. The U.S. government continued to insist that nothing unusual had happened in Roswell in 1947. But the public was not so easily convinced. By the 1990s, the Air Force conducted yet another investigation into the Roswell incident, this time releasing a detailed report titled The Roswell Report Case, closed in it. The Air Force maintained that the wreckage had indeed been from a Project Mogul balloon, but they also addressed the claims of alien bodies, according to the report. The so-called alien bodies were most likely crash test dummies that had been used in various experiments, which had been misremembered by witnesses over the years. But even this explanation did little to quell the ongoing speculation. To this day, Roswell remains a symbol of government secrecy, and the possibility that we are not alone in the universe. Was it a weather balloon, as the military claimed, or was it something more? A craft from another world that crashed in the New Mexico desert? The truth about Roswell may never be fully known, but one thing is certain. Whatever happened in the summer of 1947 has left an indelible mark on our culture and our imagination. Roswell is more than just a small town in New Mexico. It is a gateway to the unknown, a place where the line between reality and mystery blurs, and where the question of "are we alone?" continues to echo through time as the decades pass. New generations are drawn to the mystery of Roswell, searching for answers in the desert winds and the scattered pieces of a puzzle that may never be fully solved. A secret government project or a craft from the stars. The Roswell incident remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern era. And as long as humanity looks to the skies and wonders what lies beyond the story of Roswell, will continue to captivate, intrigue, and inspire. The abduction of Betty and Barney Hill. It was a crisp autumn evening on September 19, 1961, when Betty and Barry Hill were driving home from a much-needed vacation in Canada. The couple, who lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, were on U.S. Route 3, making their way through the quiet, isolated White Mountains. They were looking forward to getting back to their everyday lives. And Barney, Betty, a postal worker and civil rights advocate, had been married for several years. They were an ordinary couple in many ways, though their lives were about to take an extraordinary turn as they wound through the dark forested roads. The night felt still, almost too quiet. The stars glittered brightly overhead, unimpeded by city lights. It was then that Betty first noticed something peculiar, a bright point of light moving erratically in the sky. At first, she assumed it was an airplane, but the way it darted back and forth, changing direction at impossible speeds, made her uneasy. "Bonnie, look at that," she said. Pointing out the windshield, Barney glanced up, but dismissed it, assuming it must have been a conventional aircraft. But as the minutes passed, the object grew larger, and its movements became stranger. It seemed to be following them. Betty's curiosity got the better of her, and she convinced Barney to pull over. They got out of the car with binoculars, hoping to get a better look. What they saw would change their lives forever. Through the lenses of the binoculars, Betty could make out more details. The object was disc-shaped, with rows of windows and colored lights that blinked in a pattern unlike any aircraft she had ever seen. What disturbed her most, however, was what she claimed she saw through those windows. Figures humanoid, but not quite human. Peering back at her, Barney too looked through the binoculars and saw something that unnerved him. His skepticism, which had been his shield throughout the encounter, began to crack. He described the craft as a pancake-shaped object that hovered silently just above the treetops. He could see figures inside, and a deep sense of dread washed over him. These weren't people. These weren't aircraft pilots. Something inside, Barney snapped. Panic overtook him, and he yelled at Betty to get back in the car. As they sped away down the dark road, the craft followed, moving effortlessly above them. Barney kept glancing in the rearview mirror, but the object was relentless, as if it had locked onto them. Then, a sudden feeling of heaviness came over them both, as if the very air had thickened. Their memories from this point on would remain fragmented and bizarre. But one thing was clear. Something had happened in those lost hours. The Hill's next conscious memory was of driving hours later, still on that deserted road, but now far beyond the point where they should have been. They felt disoriented and strangely fatigued. By the time they reached home, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. They stumbled into their house, exhausted and confused, trying to make sense of what had transpired over the following days. Betty became plagued by vivid nightmares in her dreams. She saw herself and Barney being forced into a craft by strange humanoid beings with large slanted eyes, gray skin, and thin, spindly bodies. These beings communicated with her telepathically, and though they showed no outward aggression, there was something cold and clinical about their actions. The creatures she recalled in her dreams performed a series of medical examinations on her and Barney. She remembered lying on a cold table while instruments were used to probe her skin, and a needle, long and painful, was inserted into her navel, a procedure she instinctively felt was related to reproductive experimentation. The beings had examined Barney as well, focusing particularly on his skeletal structure, teeth, and eyes. Betty's dreams were so vivid that they left her deeply disturbed. She shared them with Barney, who was initially reluctant to believe that anything extraordinary had happened. However, as days passed, Barney too began to feel that something had been done to them. He started to experience strange physical sensations and emotional distress that he couldn't explain. His health deteriorated rapidly, with ulcers, high blood pressure, and recurring anxiety that seemed to stem from the encounter. Desperate for answers, the Hills sought help. In the months that followed, they contacted UFO researchers and eventually turned to a prominent psychiatrist, Dr. Benjamin Simon, who specialized in hypnosis. They hoped that through hypnosis, they could uncover the lost memories of those missing hours. What unfolded in Dr. Simon's sessions would send shockwaves through the small, close-knit UFO community and beyond. Both Betty and Barney, under hypnosis, recounted eerily similar stories of being abducted by extraterrestrial beings. They described the craft in meticulous detail, its metallic exterior, the oddly shaped interior, and the rooms where they had been taken for examination. Betty described her captors as grays beings with large almond-shaped eyes, no noses to speak of, and small lipless mouths. They were short, about 5 feet tall, with long arms that reached down to their knees, and they moved with a peculiar fluidity. They communicated telepathically, and though Betty sensed a lack of empathy, she did not feel as though they intended to harm her. They seemed more like conducting experiments without any real regard for her emotions. Barney's recollections were similar, though his experience seemed more traumatic under hypnosis. He recalled being terrified, unable to move. As the beings examined him, he remembered the coldness of the metal table and the clinical precision with which the creatures handled him. At one point, Barney recalled the beings examining his genitals, and he later speculated that they might have been collecting reproductive material. One of the most striking aspects of their hypnosis sessions was the consistency between their stories, despite the fact that neither had discussed these details with each other prior to the sessions. Moreover, both Betty and Barney described a star map that Betty had seen while aboard the craft. The map, she said, was shown to her by one of the beings, and it depicted trade route between various stars in our galaxy. Betty drew this map from memory while under hypnosis, and years later, a school teacher and amateur astronomer named Marjorie Fish would attempt to match the map to known star systems. Fish's analysis suggested that the map aligned with the Zeta Reticuli star system, a binary star system located about 39 light-years from Earth. Though this connection remains speculative, the Hills story, once made public, caused a sensation. It was one of the first widely reported cases of alien abduction, and the details of their experience became a template for many abduction reports that would follow skeptics. However, were quick to point out the inconsistencies in their story. Some argued that the Hills had merely experienced a shared delusion influenced by the growing interest in UFOs. At the time, others suggested that the Hills' experience was a form of sleep paralysis or a manifestation of subconscious fears. Despite the skepticism, Betty and Barney stood by their story. They never sought fame or fortune from their experience, and both maintained that something extraordinary had happened to them on that lonely road in the White Mountains. For the rest of their lives, they would be asked about that night. And while Barney passed away in 1969, Betty continued to speak about the abduction until her death in 2004. The legacy of the Betty and Barney Hill abduction lives on as one of the most famous and most controversial UFO stories in history. For many, their tale represents a genuine encounter with extraterrestrial beings, a pivotal moment in human history when our species was for the first time taken by beings from another world. For others, it is simply a reflection of the anxieties of the Cold War era, when the threat of the unknown loomed large in the collective psyche. But whether one believes the Hills story or not, one thing is certain: their account has shaped the modern understanding of alien abductions, leaving an indelible mark on popular culture in the study of UFO phenomena. The experience of Betty and Barney Hill remains even decades later, a mystery that continues to captivate those who look up at the stars and wonder, are we alone? The Vaughn's UFO incident. It was the autumn of 1989, and the Soviet Union, facing increasing political and economic turmoil, was rapidly changing. In the midst of these significant transformations, the small industrial city of Voroneth found itself at the center of a bizarre and eerie event, one that would not only baffle the local community, but also capture international attention. This story is one of the strangest in UFO history and remains to this day an unsolved mystery. The incident took place on September 27, 1989. It was a typical day for the people of Vors. Children were playing in the city park near the outskirts, a popular spot for families to gather after school and work. The weather was mild, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, and the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows over the grassy fields. On this particular day, no one expected anything out of the ordinary around 6:30 in the evening. As the children laughed and played, something unusual caught their attention high in the sky. An object appeared, a bright light moving strangely unlike any airplane or helicopter they had ever seen. At first it was small, almost like a star, but it soon became clear that this was no ordinary celestial object. The light grew larger as it descended toward the ground, and soon several children and adults gathered in the park began to realize they were witnessing something incredible. The object was disc-shaped, massive, and glowing with a metallic sheen that reflected the dying light of the day. It moved silently, no hum, no roar, no sound of engines, nothing. This eerie quiet unnerved the onlookers. Many Soviet citizens familiar with aircraft of various types were immediately struck by the fact that this craft seemed to defy everything they knew about flying machines. Witnesses described the object as a huge flying saucer, at least 30 feet wide, floating just above the treetops. It hovered there for several moments. Children ran to adults pointing excitedly and nervously at the sky. Some of the adults, at first skeptical, soon found themselves just as captivated by the sight. The craft was undeniably real. There was no mistaking it. Then, without warning, the object began to descend. It landed gently in the middle of the park, causing a hush shock to spread through the crowd. No one moved. No one screamed. They just stood there, frozen as the saucer rested on the grass in front of them. And then the real terror began. A hatch opened on the side of the craft. What stepped out of it defied any explanation. The first figure to emerge was tall, nearly 10 feet in height, humanoid in shape, but entirely alien in appearance. Witnesses would later describe these beings in remarkable detail. Their bodies were covered in sleek metallic-looking suits, and they moved with a strange grace, as if they were gliding rather than walking. But it was their faces that were the most disturbing. These creatures had 3 large, unblinking eyes. 2 were set in the usual position on either side of the head, but a third larger eye was placed squarely in the middle of their foreheads. This unsettling visage gave the beings an almost otherworldly aura, alien and frightening, yet strangely calm in their movements. The onlookers watched in stunned silence as these creatures exited the craft. The children, who had moments earlier been running and playing, now stood still, captivated by what they were seeing. They pointed, whispering in fear and amazement. The adults, though perhaps more rational in their approach, found themselves equally spellbound. The beings moved in a deliberate, almost robotic fashion, though they seemed to be surveying their surroundings. Their large, unblinking eyes scanned the park, taking in the humans who were now their audience. They didn't communicate in any way that the witnesses could understand, not with spoken words anyway. Some of the children later claimed they felt as though the creatures were speaking to them in their minds, a sensation of telepathy. But this too could have been the result of fear and confusion. And then something even stranger happened. A second figure emerged from the craft. This one even more bizarre than the first. It was a robot-like being, massive in size, with a boxy mechanical body. Its movements were stiff, jerky, and far less graceful than the humanoids. The robot had a cylindrical shape, with appendages that moved in ways that seemed almost mechanical in nature. It had a glowing red light in the center of its head, which pulsated softly. As it moved forward, seemingly under the control of the alien beings, the witnesses described feeling a deep primal fear as this robot-like creature approached. It was unlike anything they had ever seen in their lives. The children huddled closer together, and the adults backed away slowly, not sure whether to run or stay. The humanoid beings and their mechanical companion appeared to be investigating the area, walking calmly through the park, as though conducting some sort of survey or experiment. Some witnesses claimed that the beings bent down to examine the grass, the trees, and even the soil, collecting samples as they moved. It was as if they were biologists in a strange land, curious about their surroundings, but unconcerned with the humans watching them. Then came the moment that would leave many of the witnesses terrified for years. One of the humanoid beings, according to accounts, raised a tubular device, pointing it toward a young boy standing with his friends. In a flash, the boy vanished, disappeared, as if he had been plucked out of existence. The other children screamed, and the adults were thrown into a panic. But before they could react, the boy reappeared confused but unharmed. What had happened to him in those fleeting moments when he was gone remains a mystery to this day. The fear among the witnesses was palpable. Now people began backing away faster, unsure of what these beings wanted or what might happen next. But the beings made no further moves toward aggression. They simply finished their bizarre inspection, turned back toward the craft, and entered it once. Again, silently as it had arrived, the craft began to rise slowly at first, then gaining speed as it ascended into the sky. Within moments, it had disappeared from sight, leaving behind only the stunned and terrified witnesses, and the faint impression of its landing in the grass. In the hours and days that followed, the story of what happened in Voroneth spread like wildfire. The local children told their parents, who in turn contacted the authorities. Soon, the entire town was buzzing with talk of the UFO landing and the strange creatures who had visited their city. The incident made its way into the local newspapers and quickly caught the attention of the Soviet media, including the state-owned news agency TASS. Unlike in many Western countries, where UFO stories were often dismissed as the stuff of fantasy, the Soviet Union's media seriously reports of the encounter were published in national newspapers with detailed descriptions of the beings and the craft provided by eyewitnesses. Soviet scientists and UFO researchers were sent to Voroneth to investigate, interviewing the witnesses and collecting samples from the park where the landing had occurred. The case gained international attention in the West, where UFO sightings were already a subject of much debate. The VOR incident was seen as both fascinating and bewildering. Many UFO researchers pointed out the unique as aspects of the case: the involvement of multiple witnesses, including children and adults, the detailed descriptions of the beings and their craft, and the fact that the Soviet government had chosen to report on it so extensively. Skeptics, of course, were quick to offer alternative explanations. Some claimed that the witnesses had experienced mass hysteria, a kind of collective delusion brought on by the tensions of the Cold War and the ever-present fear of the unknown. Others suggested that the craft and the beings were part of a secret Soviet military experiment, misinterpreted by civilians who were unfamiliar with advanced technology. There were also those who believed the entire incident was a hoax, perhaps fabricated by the children for attention, or by local media, looking for a sensational story. But for the witnesses, the memory of what they had seen remained vivid and undeniable. No matter how many people doubted their story, they insisted that they had seen the beings with their own eyes and had watched as the craft descended from the sky. In the months and years that followed, the VOR UFO encounter became one of the most famous and hotly debated incidents in UFO history. While it remains a source of controversy, it also stands out as one of the few cases where multiple witnesses, including children and adults, claim to have seen extraterrestrial beings, and their craft up close to this day. The truth behind what happened in Voroneth that evening remains elusive. Was it a visitation from another world? A secret military experiment gone wrong, or simply the result of overactive imaginations? No one can say for certain, but for those who were there standing in that park, under the darkening sky, the memory of that strange and terrifying encounter will never fade. The Rendlesham Forest Incident. The Rendlesham Forest Incident has come to be known as the UK's Roswell, and for good reason. What unfolded over the course of several nights in late December 1980 would become one of the most well-documented and debated UFO sightings in history, with multiple witnesses, official military reports, audio recordings, and even claims of direct contact with an unidentified craft. This event remains shrouded in mystery. But what really happened during those cold winter nights in the dense forests near RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge? Let's begin the story at the beginning. It was December 26, 1980. Boxing Day in the United Kingdom. While many people were still in the midst of holiday celebrations, the night was anything but festive for the U.S. Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, two military air bases situated in Suffolk, England, near the vast and eerie Rendlesham Forest. Both bases were under the control of the U.S. military as part of NATO's presence during the height of the Cold War. Tensions were high, and the possibility of confrontation with the Soviet Union was always in the back of everyone's mind. Just after midnight, strange lights were spotted in the forest by a group of security personnel at RAF Woodbridge. At first they thought it might be a downed aircraft after all, with two active air bases nearby. The sight of strange lights in the sky wasn't entirely uncommon, but something about these lights was different. Unsettling, even the colors seemed unusual, flickering between red, blue, and white, and the way they moved through the trees defied the usual behavior of any aircraft they were familiar with. Staff Sergeant Jim Peniston, along with two other airmen, was sent to investigate. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the lights grew brighter, pulsating in an almost hypnotic rhythm. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. An actual crash, metallic and silent, resting in the clearing between the trees it had landed, or perhaps it had crashed. But there were no signs of damage or a typical debris field. The craft, according to Peniston and his men, was small, around 9 feet wide at the base, triangular in shape and covered in strange symbols or hieroglyphics. These symbols were unlike anything the men had ever seen before, appearing to be carved into the smooth metallic surface. The air around it felt thick, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on their arms stand up. The temperature in the clearing seemed to drop, adding to the otherworldly atmosphere. At this point, Peniston did something few would have the courage to do. Despite the overwhelming sense, he approached the craft, drawn to it as if in a trance. Reaching out his hand, he touched the surface. It was cold, colder than metal should be. In the relatively mild English winter, the texture was smooth, but the symbols carved into it seemed to glow faintly under his fingers. As he made contact, he felt a strange sensation, a kind of mental jolt, almost like static electricity running through his body. His mind filled with flashes of binary code, which made no sense to him. At the time, he quickly withdrew, his heart racing. The other armed man stood frozen, too afraid to move or speak. The situation had escalated from strange to inexplicable. Before they could make any further observations, the craft began to lift off the ground. It rose slowly at first, almost gracefully, before shooting up into the sky with a speed that none of them could comprehend. The lights vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but the shaken airmen and the disturbed ground where the craft had rested. By the time they returned to the base, The men were in a state of shock. They immediately reported the incident to their superiors, who were skeptical but couldn't ignore the urgency and sincerity in the airman's voices. The decision was made to return to the site the next day to investigate in daylight. On the morning of December 26, 1980, a team of military personnel, including the Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt, went back to the area in Rendlesham Forest where the incident had occurred. What they found was undeniable evidence that something had indeed landed. The trees around the clearing were scorched, and there were strange indentations in the ground, as if heavy weight had pressed into the earth. Gear counters registered abnormal levels of radiation at the site far above what would be expected in a natural environment, but the strangeness didn't end there. Over the next 2 nights, the lights returned. Lieutenant Colonel Halt himself led another team into the forest, this time armed with recording equipment to document whatever they might find as they ventured deeper into the woods. The lights reappeared, dancing between the trees, moving in ways that no aircraft could replicate. Halt, using his handheld tape recorder, described what he and his men were witnessing. In real time, his voice captured on the recordings is tense and confused. "It's back again," he said at one point as the lights hovered just above the ground. "There's no doubt about it. This is weird." The team continued to track the lights, which seemed to be toying with them, moving away whenever they got too close, only to reappear in another part of the forest. At one point, the light shot beams of light down onto the ground, almost like searchlights, illuminating the area in an unnatural glow. The men were baffled, and though they were highly trained military personnel, none of them could offer a rational explanation for what they were seeing. Despite their best efforts to approach the phenomenon, the lights eventually disappeared into the night, leaving behind only confusion and a growing sense of unease for Halt. And the others, the experience was both surreal and terrifying. How could something so vivid, so real be explained? And more importantly, what had they encountered in the following days? Official reports were written detailing the events of those nights. These reports included not only the accounts of the witnesses, but also the physical evidence gathered from the site, radiation levels, impressions in the ground, and the strange markings on the trees. But despite the thorough documentation, the incident was quickly swept under the rug. The Cold War was in full swing, and the military had no desire to draw attention to something as bizarre as a UFO sighting. Especially on British soil, for years, the Rendlesham Forest incident remained relatively unknown outside military circles. It wasn't until the 1980s when UFO researchers gained access to some of the declassified reports and witnessed testimonies that the story began to circulate more widely. The fact that so many military personnel had witnessed the events, many of them highly credible individuals, added a layer of legitimacy that few other UFO cases could claim. Lt. Colonel Charles Halt, in particular, became a key figure in bringing the story to light in the years. Following the incident, he gave numerous interviews, often expressing his frustration at the lack of official acknowledgement or investigation into what had happened. He firmly believed that what he and his men had witnessed was not of this earth. Jim Penniston, the airman who had touched the craft, also became a central figure in the story. Years later, he revealed more about the strange binary code he had seen in his mind after touching the object. He claimed that upon returning home, he had written down pages and pages of these binary sequences, which he didn't understand at the time. It wasn't until decades later that the code was analyzed by computer experts, who found including coordinates of locations around the Earth, places of ancient significance, like the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Nazca lines in Peru. Whether these binary sequences were truly of alien origin remains a matter of debate, but Penniston stands by his experience. Despite the military's attempts to downplay the incident, the Rendlesham Forest event has become one of the most famous UFO encounters in history. It is often referred to as the UK's Roswell due to its high-profile nature and the numerous witnesses involved. What makes the case particularly compelling is the sheer volume of evidence, official military reports, audio recordings of the event as it happened, physical traces left behind in the forest, and the testimonies of multiple credible witnesses. But, as with any UFO story, there are skeptics. Some have suggested that the lights seen by the military personnel were nothing more than the distant beams of a lighthouse or perhaps aircraft from nearby air bases. Others have proposed more exotic explanations, like experimental military technology being tested in secret. However, none of these theories fully account for the strange lights, the physical evidence, or the personal experiences of those involved, for the men who witnessed the Rendlesham forest incident. It was a life-changing event. Many of them, including Halt and Peniston, have spent decades trying to understand what they saw, seeking answers that remain elusive. Was it an extraterrestrial encounter, as some believe? Or was it something more terrestrial, shrouded in secrecy? Whatever the truth may be, the Rendlesham Forest incident stands as one of the most mysterious and well-documented UFO sightings in history. The forest, once just another quiet patch of English countryside, is now forever linked with the unknown, an enduring symbol of humanity's ongoing quest to understand the mysteries of the universe. The Isle School UFO encounter. It was an ordinary spring morning on September 16, 1994, at the Ariel School in Rua, Zimbabwe. The school, located in the countryside, was surrounded by open fields and dense trees, a peaceful environment for the children who attended. On this day, the sun was shining and the air was filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing during their morning break. Little did they know that morning would be etched into their memories forever, marking an experience that would leave them bewildered and searching for answers for the rest of their lives. At around 10 a.m., as the teachers held a staff meeting indoors, over 60 children were outside on the playground, playing soccer, swinging on the jungle gym, and enjoying the freedom of a sunny day. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, was scattered across the playground when suddenly several of them noticed something strange on the horizon. At first, it looked like a bright, shining light, a flash of silver in the distance, but it quickly became apparent that this wasn't an airplane or any other object. They recognized a group of children gathered near the edge of the playground, which bordered a field filled with trees and tall grass. As they stared into the sky, the light moved closer and closer, descending towards the ground. Soon what they saw came into sharp focus. A craft, metallic in appearance, hovered just beyond the boundary of the school's property. The object, which the children would later describe as a disc or saucer shaped, landed in the tall grass just beyond the school grounds. Its surface gleamed in the bright sunlight, and it emitted a low, almost humming sound. But the craft itself was only the beginning of what the children witnessed that day. As the children stood, frozen, watching the strange object, they saw movement near the craft, beings humanoid in shape, but unlike anything they had ever seen before, emerged from the craft. These beings were small, standing only about 3 or 4 feet tall. Their heads were disproportionately large for their bodies, and their eyes, huge, black, almond-shaped, dominated their faces. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and they had thin bodies dressed in tight-fitting black suits that seemed to shimmer slightly as they moved. The children described the beings with remarkable consistency. Despite their various ages and levels of understanding, their accounts would later shock investigators, not just because of the strange nature of the encounter, but because of how eerily consistent the descriptions were across dozens of children who at the time had no reason or ability to elaborate on a shared story. Several of the children felt a sudden strange sensation, an urge to move closer to the beings. even though they were terrified. There was something about the creatures that was mesmerizing, as if they were drawing the children toward them. One of the oldest students, a girl named Emily, would later recount how she felt a sense of deep calm wash over her, almost as if she was in a dream, even though what she was witnessing was beyond anything she could comprehend. Some of the children felt an even more unsettling sensation, a kind of communication, but not in words. Many of the children later reported that the beings spoke to them, but not with their mouths. Instead, the beings communicated telepathically, sending messages directly into the children's minds, and the message they delivered was both alarming and profound. The beings, according to the children, conveyed warnings about the future of the Earth. They told the children that humanity was on a dangerous path, one that was leading to the destruction of the environment. The children recalled the beings showing them images, visions of forests burning, rivers drying up, and pollution spreading across the planet. They felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and urgency, as if the beings were pleading with them to understand the importance of protecting the Earth. One of the children, a boy named John, later described feeling as though the beings were trying to tell him that humanity was not taking care of the planet, and that if they didn't stop, the future would be bleak. The warning wasn't angry or harsh, but it was direct, leaving the children with a deep sense of responsibility for the future of the world. But as quickly as the beings had appeared, the encounter came to an end. The craft began to hum once again, and in an instant, the beings were gone, vanishing into the trees, or perhaps returning to the craft, which lifted off the ground and disappeared into the sky without a sound. The entire encounter had lasted only a few minutes, but it felt much longer to the children. For them, time seemed to stretch and bend during the encounter, adding to the surreal nature of the experience, shaken and confused. The children rushed back to the main building to tell their teachers what had just happened. The younger ones were frightened, some crying, while the older children were excited and filled with questions. When the teacher returned from their meeting, they were greeted with a chaotic scene. Dozens of children all talking at once, trying to explain what they had just witnessed. At first, the teachers were skeptical, thinking the children had simply seen a strange light, or perhaps an airplane flying overhead. But as the children continued to describe the craft, the beings, and the telepathic messages, the teachers began to realize that something extraordinary had happened. The details were too specific, too consistent, to be dismissed as a figment of imagination or a group prank. One teacher, Mrs. Mackay, later admitted that the sincerity in the children's voices and the fear in their eyes convinced her that they had experienced something very real over the next several days. News of the encounter spread throughout the school and eventually reached the surrounding community. Local media picked up the story, and soon word of the Ariel school sighting reached national and international news outlets. Investigators, including UFO researchers, scientists, and even a BBC film crew, descended on the small school to interview the children and try to make sense of what had happened. The investigators, many of whom had dealt with UFO sightings before, were struck by the consistency of the children's testimonies. Over 60 children, all describing the same event, the same beings, the same craft, and the same telepathic messages. Please subscribe our channel for more like this video and hit the like button. Come back to story. It was unprecedented. Some of the older children were even asked to draw what they had seen. The resulting sketches, though drawn independently, were nearly identical, showing saucer-shaped crafts and large-headed black-eyed beings standing near the trees. One of the most notable figures to investigate the case was Dr. John Mack, a Harvard-trained psychiatrist who specialized in the study of alien abductions and encounters. Dr. Mack spent days at the school interviewing the children one by one. He was particularly intrigued by the psychological impact of the event. He found that the children were not only consistent in their descriptions, but also showed no signs of deception or trauma. They spoke about the event with a kind of innocent matter of finesse, as if they were recounting an unusual but real experience. This sincerity, coupled with the consistency of their accounts, led Dr. Mack to believe that the children had experienced something profound, something beyond ordinary explanation. The message that the beings had communicated about environmental destruction also struck a chord with Dr. Mack. He noted that such a message seemed far beyond the understanding of the children, especially the younger ones. These were not messages that 6 or 7-year-olds would normally invent or focus on, yet they spoke of the Earth's fragile state of pollution and ecological imbalance, as if they had been shown a glimpse of the future. This, for Dr. Mack, added a layer of complexity to the case, suggesting that the encounter wasn't just about seeing a strange craft. It was about receiving a warning. School incident has continued to gain attention. Unlike many other UFO sightings, which are often debunked or dismissed as hoaxes, the testimonies of the children were hard to discredit. There were too many witnesses all providing the same details, and their sincerity made it difficult for skeptics to dismiss the event outright. While some skeptics suggested the children might have been influenced by something they had seen on TV, or that they had collectively imagined the event, those who interviewed the children directly found such explanations lacking for the children themselves. The encounter left a lasting impression. Many of them, now adults, still vividly recall what they saw that day. Some of them continued to feel a deep connection to the message about protecting the Earth, and they spoke of the encounter as a pivotal moment in their lives. For them, it was not just an encounter with the unknown. It was a call to action, a reminder that the future of the planet was in their hands. The Ariel school incident remains one of the most compelling and well-documented UFO encounters in history. The sheer number of witnesses, combined with the consistency of their testimonies and the profound message delivered by the beings, makes it a case that continues to intrigue and puzzle researchers, skeptics and believers alike. Though decades have passed since that spring morning in Zimbabwe, the questions remain. What did those children see? Who were the beings that communicated with them? And was the warning about environmental destruction a message from another world, or simply a reminder that the future of our planet is in our hands? The Zamora UFO incident. It was a quiet afternoon on April 24, 1964, in the small town of Socorro, New Mexico. For Lonnie Zamora, a local police officer, it began as any other day on the job. The desert town was a slow-paced place where not much ever happened, beyond the occasional speeding car or a call about a lost cow. Little did Zamora know that before the day was over, he would witness something that would not only shake him to his core, but also leave the world with one of the most enduring and well-documented UFO cases in history. One that remains unsolved to this day at around 5:45 p.m. Officer Zamora was on routine patrol when he noticed a car speeding down the highway, racing along the desert road just outside of Socorro. He immediately gave chase, flipping on his lights and sirens, but as he pursued the car, something unexpected caught his attention. A loud roar like a thunderous explosion echoed through the air, accompanied by a bright flash. In the distance, the sound was so jarring, so out of place in the vast, still desert, that Zamora momentarily forgot about the speeder and turned his car toward the source of the noise. The desert landscape, barren and windswept, stretched out for miles with only scattered patches of scrub and jagged rocks breaking up the flat expanse. As Zamora drove toward the sound, he spotted something unusual on the horizon, something metallic gleaming in the afternoon sun. At first, he thought it might have been an overturned vehicle, perhaps a truck that had rolled off the road and crashed into the arroyo. But as he got closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary accident. Zamora brought his patrol car to a stop and cautiously stepped out his hand, Resting instinctively on his holstered pistol, the metallic object sat in a shallow ravine about 150 yards away, partially obscured by the scrubby brush. It was oval-shaped, smooth and reflective, with a strange insignia on the side red markings that looked like some kind of symbol. Though he couldn't quite make it out from a distance, the craft stood on what appeared to be landing gear with 4 legs extending down to the ground. But it wasn't just the craft that caught Zamora's attention. It was what he saw next. 2 small figures, humanoid, but shorter than any adult human, were standing beside the craft. They were dressed in white coveralls or jumpsuits, and their movement seemed deliberate, as though they were working on something near the base of the object. At first, Zamora thought they might have been children, perhaps involved in some sort of accident, though the strangeness of the scene made him hesitate. As he began to move closer, the figures seemed to notice his presence, turning to look in his direction. Zamora would later describe the sense of unease that washed over him. In that moment, there was something off about the figures. Something that didn't fit. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. But his police Einstein told him to approach with caution as he started down the incline toward the ravine, intending to offer help or at least investigate the craft. Suddenly emitted a loud, deafening roar. The sound was like nothing Zamora had ever heard before. It wasn't the roar of a car engine, nor was it the rumble of an airplane. It was more like the deep, thunderous growl of a rocket engine, accompanied by an intense vibration that shook the ground. Zamora ducked behind his patrol troll car, bracing himself, as the roar intensified. A moment later, a bright blue-orange flame shot out from beneath the craft, and in an instant, it lifted off the ground. The craft ascended quickly, almost effortlessly, as if gravity held no sway over it. Zamora watched in astonishment as the object rose into the sky, the flame beneath it growing fainter as it gained altitude. There was no visible propeller, no wings, no sign of conventional propulsion. It simply hovered, defying all logic and reason. Within seconds, the craft had cleared the ridge of the arroyo and shot off into the distance, disappearing into the vast, cloudless sky. The roar of its engines faded into the wind, leaving behind only an eerie silence. Zamora stood frozen for several moments, his heart pounding in his chest. What had he just seen? He had no answers, only a deep sense of confusion and disbelief. After regaining his composure, he cautiously approached the spot where the craft had been. The heat from the flame was still lingering in the air, and the ground was scorched, blackened in several places where the landing gear had touched down. The brush nearby was also singed, a clear sign that whatever had been there was real. There were no signs of the strange figures. They had vanished with the craft. But the landing site was undeniable. There were 4 distinct impressions in the dirt spaced evenly apart, marking where the craft had rested. The red markings on the side of the craft, which Zamora had briefly glimpsed, were also burned into his memory. Though he couldn't make sense of them, shaken by the encounter, Zamora quickly radioed for backup, his voice trembling as he tried to explain what he had seen within minutes. Other officers arrived at the scene, along with members of the New Mexico State Police. They found Zamora visibly disturbed, his usually calm demeanor shaken. He led them to the site where the scorched earth and landing impressions were clear evidence that something had been there. Word of the incident spread quickly through the small town of Sakuro, and it wasn't long before it reached the ears of the U.S. Air Force. At the time, the Air Force had a dedicated program for investigating UFO sightings called Project Blue Book, and this case immediately caught their attention. An officer from Project Blue Book, Sergeant David Moody, was dispatched to Sakuro to interview Zamora and investigate the site. The Air Force, along with other experts, carefully examined the landing area. They measured the impressions in the ground, analyzed the scorched vegetation, and took detailed notes on Zamora's account of the encounter. The evidence was compelling. There was no doubt that something had landed in the desert, and the physical traces left behind were unlike anything typically seen in a natural or man-made accident. Despite the thorough investigation, no conclusive explanation could be found. The Air Force considered several possibilities, including a secret military test or an experimental aircraft. But none of these explanations fit the details of Zamora's sighting: the lack of any debris. The strange symbols on the craft and the humanoid figures only added to the mystery. Even the most skeptical investigators were left scratching their heads as the investigation continued. More people in the area began coming forward with their own accounts of strange sightings around the time of the incident. Some residents reported seeing bright lights in the sky that same afternoon, while others claimed to have heard the loud roar that Zora described. These additional sightings, while not as well documented as Zamora, lent further credibility to the idea that something truly unusual had happened in the Sakura Desert. In the months and years that followed, the Sakura incident became one of the most famous UFO cases in the world. Zamora, a well-respected officer with no history of making sensational claims, was considered a credible witness by both the public and investigators. His detailed description of the craft and its occupants, along with the physical evidence left behind, made the case difficult to dismiss. Zamora himself was reluctant to talk about the incident. In the years after it occurred, he didn't seek fame or attention, quite the opposite. He found the experience unsettling and often avoided discussing it with reporters or UFO enthusiasts who came to Sakura looking for answers. He remained adamant, however, that what he had seen that day was real. It was no illusion, no trick of the light. He had witnessed a craft land in the desert, seen its strange occupants, and watched as it flew away, defying all conventional explanation. The Sakura UFO incident remains unsolved to this day. Despite extensive investigations by the Air Force, independent researchers, and skeptics alike, no definitive explanation has ever been found. It stands as one of the most well-documented and credible UFO sightings in history, with both physical evidence and a trustworthy eyewitness account. Have been proposed, some suggesting that the craft was an experimental vehicle being tested by the military, others speculating that it was a hoax perpetrated by local students. But none of these explanations adequately account for the full range of details reported by Zamora, nor do they explain the physical traces left behind at the site. For those who believe in the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation, the Sakura incident is seen as one of the most compelling pieces of evidence for skeptics. It remains an unsolved mystery, a riddle that may never be fully explained. As for Lon Zamora, his life returned to a semblance of normalcy in the years after the incident, though the memory of that day in the desert stayed with him for the rest of his life. What he saw that afternoon in 1964 remains one of the great mysteries of the UFO phenomenon, an encounter that left behind more questions than answers. The Westall UFO incident. It was the morning of April 6, 1966, in the quiet Melbourne suburb of Clayton, South Australia. The students at Westall High School were enjoying their mid-M morning break, a chance to stretch their legs, chat with friends, and escape. The classroom for a little while. The day was warm, the sky was clear, and for the students and teachers alike, it was just another typical school day. However, what began as an ordinary morning would soon turn into one of Australia's most extraordinary and well-documented UFO encounters. More than 200 students and teachers would witness something that would baffle them for the rest of their lives. A large saucer-shaped object descending from the sky in broad daylight. It all started just after 11 a.m. A group of students playing on the sports field first noticed it. At first, it appeared as a strange metallic glint in the sky, like a flash of light reflecting off a distant object. As the students watched, curious but not yet alarmed, The object grew larger, descending from the sky. At a rapid pace, they quickly realized that this was no ordinary AR aircraft. The object was round metallic, and unlike anything they had ever seen before, words spread quickly among the students, and soon dozens of them were running toward the school's oval, and the surrounding field's eyes fixed on the sky. A few teachers, hearing the commotion, followed the students outside, unsure of what was causing the excitement. But when they saw the object hovering silently above the nearby Grange Reserve, a wooded area with fields and open spaces, they were just as shocked as the children. The craft, according to witnesses, was large silver or gray in color, and disc-shaped it, hovered silently for several moments, moving back and forth slightly, as if surveying the ground below. Some students would later describe it as resembling two saucers placed rim to rim, a classic flying saucer shape that had become iconic in UFO lore by that time, as the students and teachers watched in awe. The crow began to descend even lower, dipping behind the tree line of the Grange Reserve. Many of the students, filled with a mixture of excitement and fear, began running toward the reserve, desperate to get a closer look. The teachers called after them, urging them to stay back. But the students, driven by sheer curiosity, ignored the warnings. Once they reached the edge of the reserve, several students could see the craft more clearly. It had touched down in a grassy field just beyond the trees, but it was still hovering slightly above the ground. For what felt like several minutes, it remained there, motionless and silent, as if it were observing something, or perhaps preparing for something. The air was thick with tension. The students, both excited and terrified, could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Then, just as quickly as it had descended, the object began to rise again. It tilted slightly to one side, then shot off into the sky at an incredible speed. The students stood frozen, watching as the craft disappeared into the distance, leaving nothing but a strange, eerie silence in its wake. Some of the children fell to the ground, breathless from running and overwhelmed by what they had just seen. Teachers, too, stood dumbfounded, unable to process what had just happened. But the strangeness of the event was not over yet, as the saucer-shaped object shot away. Witnesses reported seeing several smaller light aircraft, or perhaps more UFOs, following it at a distance. These objects moved quickly, pursuing the larger craft across the sky, before they too vanished from sight. Whether these were military planes or other unidentified objects remains unclear, but their presence added another layer of mystery to the already bewildering encounter. The immediate aftermath of the sighting was chaotic. The students, buzzing with adrenaline, returned to the school grounds, shouting and talking over one another, each eager to tell their story. The teachers, struggling to regain control, tried to calm the students down, but their own shock made it difficult to process. Insisted on going back to the Grange Reserve to see if any traces of the craft remained, and soon a large group had gathered in the field where the object had landed. What they found only deepened the mystery. In the spot where the craft had hovered, there was a large circular patch of flattened ground. The ground looked as if something heavy had pressed down on it, but there were no scorch marks, no signs of fire or other conventional explanations. The grass was simply bent in a perfect circle, as if it had been crushed by an unseen force. The students and teachers stood around the area, staring at the strange formation, unsure of what to make of it. Some of the older students tried to take samples of the grass, while others ran their hands over the flattened ground, hoping to find some clue that could explain what had happened. Word of the sighting spread quickly by the afternoon. Local news outlets had picked up the story, and reporters descended on Westall High School, eager to interview the witnesses. Over the following days, the incident became a sensation, with newspaper articles and television segments covering the event, and the students' incredible accounts. One of the key aspects that made the Westall UFO incident so compelling was the sheer number of witnesses. Over 200 people, including students, teachers, and local residents, all saw the same thing: a large metallic saucer-shaped object descending from the sky, hovering near the school, and then shooting off at an impossible speed. The consistency of their descriptions was remarkable, with many of the witnesses independently describing the object in almost identical terms. Among the most credible witnesses was Andrew Greenwood, a science teacher at Westall High School. Greenwood had initially been skeptical of the students' claims, but after stepping outside and seeing the object himself, he realized that this was no ordinary phenomenon. Greenwood would later give detailed interviews describing what he had seen, expressing his frustration at not being able to explain the event through conventional science. In the days following the sighting, the mystery deepened. Witnesses claimed that shortly after the incident, military personnel arrived at the scene. Men in dark uniforms were seen walking around the Grange Reserve, inspecting the flattened grass and collecting samples. Some of the students reported that these men told them not to speak about what they had seen, warning them to keep quiet. One student, a girl named Tanya, later claimed that she was pulled aside and questioned by men who identified themselves as government officials. They pressed her to recount the event and urged her not to talk to the media. The presence of these men only fueled speculation that the government knew more about the incident than it was letting on. Despite the intense media interest, official explanations were slow to emerge. Some skeptics suggested that the object might have been a weather balloon or a military aircraft conducting tests, but these explanations did little to satisfy those who had witnessed the event. The speed at which the craft moved, its unconventional shape, and the strange, smaller objects that followed it made such explanations seem inadequate. The Australian government and military largely stayed silent on the matter, offering no official explanation for the sighting. UFO researchers, however, became fascinated by the case, and over the years it has remained one of the most studied and debated UFO encounters in the world. The Westall incident is often referred to as Australia's Roswell, a reference to the famous UFO sighting in the United States, because of the large number of witnesses and the enduring mystery surrounding it for the students and teachers who experienced it. The Westall UFO encounter left a lasting mark. Many of them now, adults, still vividly remember that day. The sight of the silver craft hovering in the sky, the flattened grass, and the feeling of awe and fear that gripped them as they watched something truly inexplicable unfold before their eyes. In the years since, there have been reunions and documentaries that have brought many of the witnesses together to recount their stories. Despite the passage of time, their memories of the event remain clear, and the consistency of their accounts continues to lend credibility to the claim that something extraordinary happened that day. Yet for all the testimony, the Westall UFO encounter remains unresolved. No definitive explanation has ever been provided, and the mystery of what exactly descended upon that Melbourne schoolyard in 1966 continues to haunt those who witnessed it. Was it an extraterrestrial craft, as some believe a secret military experiment, or something else entirely beyond our understanding? Whatever the truth may be, the Westall UFO incident stands as one of the most significant and well-documented UFO sightings in Australia's history. It remains a fascinating and unsettling reminder that there are still beyond that, we have yet to unravel the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter. It was a hot, humid night on August 21st, 1955, in the rural farming community of Kelly, Kentucky. The Sutton family had gathered at their small farmhouse for a quiet evening, with friends unaware that the events of that night would soon spiral into one of the most bizarre and terrifying encounters in UFO history. What unfolded at the Sutton home just outside of Hopkinsville would become known as the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter, a case so strange that it continues to bewilder and divide researchers to this day. The Sutton family's farmhouse was modest, situated at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by fields and thick woods. The night had begun like any other lucky Sutton. His wife and several family members, along with a friend named Billy Ray Taylor, had settled in for a peaceful evening. After spending the day working on the farm, the children were playing, and the adults were chatting over drinks in the kitchen when the first sign of trouble appeared around 7 p.m. Billy Ray stepped outside to fetch some water from the well. As he looked up at the clear Kentucky sky, he saw something that made him freeze in his tracks above the tree line. There was a strange light moving rapidly across the sky, far too fast and erratic to be a plane or a star. It appeared to be glowing, almost pulsating, and within moments it descended toward the ground, landing somewhere in the nearby woods. Confused and more than a little unnerved, Billy Ray rushed back inside to tell the others what he had seen. At first, the Suttons laughed off Billy Ray's story. Surely he was just playing a prank, or had seen a shooting star. But as Billy Ray insisted describing the light's movements and its descent, the family's skepticism began to waver. Something about his expression, his wide-eyed urgency, made them realize that whatever he had seen, he truly believed it. A tense atmosphere fell over the farmhouse as the evening wore on. The family kept a wary eye on the windows, though none of them seriously expected anything more to happen. But then, just after 8 p.m., Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray noticed something unusual outside. There was a strange glow coming from the edge of the woods, just beyond the property. The two men stepped outside to investigate, hoping it was nothing more than a trick of the light, or perhaps a neighbor's flashlight. But what they saw made their hearts race with fear. From the shadows of the trees emerged a small figure, no more than 3 feet tall. Its skin was silvery or metallic, reflecting the moonlight, and it moved with an eerie gliding motion as though its feet barely touched the ground. Its head was oversized with pointed ears, glowing yellow eyes, and long claw-like hands that extended from its thin arms. The creature appeared to have no clothes, and its body shimmered as it approached the house. Lucky and Billy Ray froze, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The creature drew closer, and as it did, more figures appeared from the woods. At least a dozen of the small beings surrounded the farmhouse, their glowing eyes fixed on the terrified men. It was as though they were closing in. And Lucky, now convinced that these creatures posed a serious threat, ran back inside, slamming the door behind him. The Sutton family by this point was in a full state of panic. The children huddled in the corner crying, while the adults scrambled to arm themselves. In those days, firearms were a common household item, especially on farms like the Sutton. Lucky grabbed a shotgun, and Billy Ray armed himself with a rifle. They were determined to protect their family from whatever was lurking outside with their weapons in hand. Lucky and Billy Ray cautiously opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The creatures were still there, watching from the shadows, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. Without hesitation, Lucky raised his shotgun and fired at the closest figure. The blast rang out across the night, but instead of falling to the ground, the creature merely flipped backward, as if the shot had no effect at all. It seemed to float momentarily, then landed on its feet again, completely unharmed. Billy Ray, equally terrified, took aim with his rifle and fired at another of the creatures. But again, the bullet seemed to have no effect. The creatures didn't bleed or stagger. They simply retreated slightly, their glowing eyes unblinking as they continued to surround the house. It was as though they were bulletproof, immune to any kind of physical harm. The men retreated inside, slamming the door behind them and barricading the windows. For the next several hours, the Sutton family was trapped in goblin-like creatures, Every so often the creatures would approach the house again, peering into the windows or climbing onto the roof, their claw-like hands tapping against the glass or the tin roof with unsettling persistence. Each time they got too close, Lucky and Billy Ray would fire, but it was useless. The creatures would merely retreat, only to return. A few moments later, the family described the creatures as having an almost playful demeanor. Despite their fearsome appearance, they didn't seem to be overtly hostile. They never tried to break into the house or harm anyone directly, but their presence, their persistence, and the fact that bullets seemed to bounce off them like pebbles made the entire situation feel like a nightmare. As the hours dragged on, the family grew increasingly desperate. The children were hysterical, and the adults were exhausted from the constant firing and the tension of waiting for the creatures to make their next move. Finally, just after midnight, Lucky and Billy Ray decided they couldn't take it any longer. They would have to make a run for help. Gathering the family, they dashed from the farmhouse to their car, piled in, and drove frantically to the Hopkinsville police station about 8 miles away. When they burst through the doors, disheveled and wide-eyed, they told the officers an unbelievable story. They had been under siege for hours by strange bulletproof creatures that had surrounded their home. At first, the police were skeptical. It sounded too outlandish to be true, but the Suttons were clearly terrified, and their account was consistent. Eventually, a group of local officers accompanied by a few military personnel from nearby Fort Campbell agreed to drive back to the farmhouse to investigate. When they arrived at the property in the early hours of the morning, the scene was eerily quiet. There was no sign of the creatures, but the officers found evidence that something had happened. The windows and walls of the house were riddled with bullet holes, and the ground outside was scorched in several places where the creatures had been shot. The officers also noted the disturbed state of the family, particularly the children who were still trembling with fear. Despite an extensive search of the surrounding area, no creatures were found, and the glowing eyes that had haunted the family were nowhere to be seen. After several hours, the police left unable to provide any answers to what had terrorized the Sutton that night. The creatures, it seemed, had vanished as mysteriously as they had appeared over the next few days. Word of the encounter spread like wildfire. Newspapers picked up the story, and soon the small town of Kelly became the center of national attention. Reporters flocked to the area, hoping to get a glimpse of the little green men that the Sutton family claimed had attacked their farmhouse. The press dubbed the event the Hopkinsville Goblin Incident, a name that would stick in the years to come as the story gained traction. Skeptics began offering alternative explanations. Some suggested that the Sutton family, perhaps intoxicated or under the influence of mass hysteria, had mistaken owls or other wildlife for alien creatures. Others proposed that it was an elaborate hoax staged by the family for attention or financial gain. However, those who knew the Sutton family were quick to dismiss these theories. The Sutton were a humble, hard-working family, not prone to making up stories or seeking the spotlight. Moreover, they had gained little from the encounter other than fear and ridicule. Their genuine terror, along with the physical evidence at the scene, left many convinced that something truly unusual had happened that night. Over the years, the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter has remained one of the most perplexing cases in UFO law. Some researchers believe that the creatures were extraterrestrial beings, perhaps scouting the area or conducting some kind of experiment. The fact that the creatures seemed impervious to bullets and disappeared without a trace only adds to the mystery. Others, however, continue to lean toward more mundane explanations, pointing to the possibility of mass hysteria or mistaken identity. Whatever the truth may be, the Kelly-Hopkinsville encounter stands as one of the most bizarre and enduring stories of its kind. The Sutton family, who never sought fame or fortune from their experience, maintained their account for the rest of their lives, insisting that what they saw that night was real. For the people of Kelly and Hopkinsville, the encounter became part of local folklore, a strange tale of otherworldly visitors that would be told and retold for generations. To this day, the Kelly community holds an annual festival celebrating the Little Green Men, a playful nod to the terrifying events of that hot August night in 1955. But beneath the fun and festivities, the question remains what really happened to the Sutton family. That night, were they visited by creatures from another world, or was it twisted by fear and imagination into a tale of extraterrestrial terror? The mystery endures, and like the glowing-eyed beings that surrounded the farmhouse, the truth remains just out of reach. The Phoenix Lights. It was the evening of March 13, 1997, when the skies over the southwestern United States became the stage for one of the most famous and puzzling UFO events in modern history, an event that would come to be known as the Phoenix Lights. What began as an ordinary Thursday night for the people of Phoenix, Arizona, soon transformed into a night of wonder and speculation, as thousands of residents reported seeing strange lights in the sky. The lights, which appeared in a V-shaped formation, hovered silently above the city, sparking a wave of confusion, excitement, and fear. To this day, the Phoenix Lights remain one of the most compelling and mysterious UFO sightings in the world. The first reports of strange lights in the sky began early that evening around 7:30 p.m., and the sightings stretched from Nevada all the way to the southern parts of Arizona. Residents from Henderson, Nevada, reported seeing an enormous triangular craft with lights at the edges. From there, reports followed a steady path southward, eventually culminating in Phoenix, where thousands of people would witness the phenomenon firsthand. For most of the evening, Phoenix buzzed with activity. Like any other night, people were returning home from work. Kids were playing in their yards, and many residents were out on their porches enjoying the cool desert air. But then shortly after 8 p.m., something appeared in the sky that would stop people in their tracks, high above the city. A series of bright, glowing lights appeared, arranged in a perfect V-shaped formation. There were 5, sometimes 7 lights, spaced evenly apart, and they moved slowly, silently across the sky. At first, many people assumed the lights were part of a military exercise, or perhaps a formation of airplanes. After all, Phoenix was near several military installations, and it wasn't uncommon for residents to see aircraft flying overhead. But as the lights continued to move, witnesses quickly realized that something was different. There was no sound, no roar of jet engines, no hum of propellers. The lights glided silently, as if floating through the sky. Dozens of people pulled out their camcorders and video cameras, capturing the strange display on film. The lights were so bright and so unmistakable that they could be seen for miles from one end of the city to the other. Drivers on highways pulled over to the side of the road to get a better look. Families stepped outside their homes, pointing to the sky in disbelief. Within minutes, thousands of people were watching the mysterious lights, all asking the same question. What is that? One of the most striking aspects of the Phoenix Lights was the sheer size of the formation. Witnesses described it as massive, stretching across the sky in a way that made it hard to believe it could be individual aircraft. Some estimated that the lights, if connected by an object, would have spanned nearly a mile across, and indeed, many people reported seeing not just the lights, but the outline of a solid dark craft behind them, so large that it blocked out the stars as it passed overhead. One witness, Tim Lay, was at home with his family when they spotted the lights approaching from the distance. As they watched, the lights grew larger until it seemed like a massive craft was flying directly over their house. Tim later described the object as the size of 3 football fields, and it moved so slowly that he and his family could track it. For several minutes, the eerie silence of the craft, combined with its immense size, left them speechless. Another witness, Dr. Lynn Kitt, was on her balcony when she saw the lights. A physician and skeptic by nature, Kitt wasn't the kind of person to jump to conclusions, but what she saw that night shook her to her core. She described the lights as being far too large and organized to be conventional aircraft, and the fact that so many other people saw the same thing convinced her that it wasn't just her imagination. Calls began flooding into local radio stations, news outlets, and even the police people from all over Phoenix were reporting the same thing, a V-shaped formation of lights moving silently across the sky. Some described seeing the lights hover for long periods, while others watched them drift slowly, before disappearing behind the mountains to the southwest. For the next several hours, the lights continued to be seen by residents across Arizona as the night wore on. However, the phenomenon faded, and the lights eventually disappeared altogether. But by then, the story had already captured the public's imagination. The next morning, local news outlets ran headlines about the mysterious lights, and footage from people's camcorders was played on TV, showing the bright orbs floating above the city within days. The Phoenix lights became enthusiasts and skeptics alike, weighing in on what the people of Phoenix had seen. Theories began to swirl almost immediately. Some speculated that the lights were part of a secret military operation, perhaps experimental aircraft being tested by the nearby Luke Air Force Base or Davis Monon Air Force Base. Others suggested that it could have been a group of airplanes flying in formation, though this theory was quickly dismissed by many witnesses, who insisted that the lights moved far too slowly and silently to be jets or planes. There was also no radar confirmation of any such formation in the area at the time. Then there were those who believed that the lights were not of this earth. UFO enthusiasts argued that the size, shape, and behavior of the light suggested a massive alien spacecraft possibly conducting a survey of the city. The fact that the craft appeared to make no sound, combined with the number of witnesses and the lack of an immediate explanation from authorities, only fueled speculation that the event was an extraterrestrial visitation. In the weeks following the sighting, the U.S. military offered a potential explanation for at least part of the phenomenon. Officials at Luke Air Force Base stated that flares had been dropped during a routine training exercise over the Barry Goldwater Range, a vast military testing area southwest of Phoenix. According to the military, these flares had created the bright lights seen by many of the witnesses. The flares' explanation, however, did not account for the earlier sightings of the V-shaped formation moving silently across the sky, leading many to believe that the flare theory was a cover-up for something much more mysterious. The flare explanation did little to satisfy those who had seen the lights up close. Witnesses like Tim Lay and Dr. Keat were adamant that what they had seen was not flares or aircraft, but something much larger and much stranger. The idea that flares could hover in perfect formation, move silently, and maintain their brightness for extended periods seemed implausible to many. Adding to the intrigue was the fact that the then governor of Arizona, F. Symington, initially marked the event during a press conference. Symington, flanked by an aide dressed in an alien costume, joked about the sighting and dismissed the idea of extraterrestrial RAL involvement. However, years later, Symington would reveal that he had personally witnessed the lights and believed they were not of this world. His change in stance only deepened the mystery and reignited the debate over what had really occurred that night. As the years passed, the Phoenix lights remained a subject of fascination, with numerous documentaries, interviews, and analyses conducted to try to unravel the mystery. The original footage captured by witnesses continues to be studied, and many experts still cannot explain what exactly the lights were. While the military's flare explanation might account for some of the later sightings, the earlier V-shaped formation remains unexplained. One of the enduring aspects of the Phoenix lights is the sheer number of witnesses. Unlike many UFO sightings, which often rely on a handful of witnesses or blurry photographs. The Phoenix lights were seen by thousands of people across a large geographic area. The consistency of their descriptions, silent glowing lights in a V-shaped formation, makes the event hard to dismiss as mass hysteria or misidentification. Moreover, the Phoenix lights have become a cultural touchstone. In the world of UFO studies, the event is frequently cited as one of the most credible UFO sightings in modern history, not just because of the number of witnesses, but because of the involvement of government officials, the military, and even media coverage that struggled to explain what had happened for those who believe in the possibility of extraterrestrial visitation. The Phoenix lights are a clear sign that we are not alone. The massive silent craft seen over Phoenix that night suggests technology far beyond anything humanity is capable of. For skeptics, the event remains an intriguing but ultimately solvable mystery, perhaps a combination of flares, military exercises, and overactive imaginations. But no matter which side of the debate you fall on, one thing is certain: the Phoenix lights captured the attention of the world and left a lasting mark on the people who witnessed them even decades later. Those who saw the lights remember that night with vivid clarity. They described the awe and confusion they felt as they watched something truly unexplainable glide silently over the desert. The Phoenix lights may never be fully explained, whether they were a secret military project, an atmospheric phenomenon, or a visitor from another world. The mystery endures, and the footage continues to be analyzed by researchers and enthusiasts alike for the people of Phoenix that night. In March 1997 remains a reminder that there are still things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that defy explanation. Abduction. It was a warm evening on October 11, 1973, when Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, two men from the small town of Gautier, Mississippi, set out for a quiet night of fishing along the Pascagoula River. Hickson, a 42-year-old shipyard worker, and Parker, a 19-year-old who had recently started working with him, were looking forward to a peaceful, uneventful night under the stars with the rhythmic sound of the water lapping against the shore. But what started as a routine fishing trip would soon turn into one of the most bizarre and well-documented alien abduction cases in history, an event that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the river, the two men settled into their favorite spot along the bank, casting their lines into the water. The river was calm, the night air thick with humidity, and for a while, everything was quiet. Just the two men, their fishing gear, and the stillness of the Mississippi night. But not long after they began fishing, something caught their attention. Something strange. At first it was a faint buzzing sound in the air, distant but growing louder by the second. Hickson and Parker glanced at each other, puzzled, trying to figure out what was causing the noise. They looked around, searching the water for any sign of disturbance, but the river remained still. Then, out of the corner of their eyes, they saw something that made their hearts skip a beat. Just above the river, hovering silently about 30 yards away, was a craft. It was oval-shaped, metallic, and glowing with a soft blue light. The craft was unlike anything they had ever seen before. There were no wings, no propellers, no visible means of propulsion. It simply floated in the air, defying gravity, making that strange buzzing sound as it hovered just above the water surface. For a moment, the two men were frozen in place, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The craft was large, about 30 feet long, and had no visible windows or doors. Hickson and Parker stood rooted to the spot, staring in disbelief. But before they could even think about running, the situation took a terrifying turn from the craft. Three strange beings emerged, floating silently toward the men. Hickson and Parker watched in horror as the figures approached. These beings were unlike anything they had ever imagined. robotic yet somehow alive. They were humanoid in shape, but not human. The creatures stood about 5 feet tall and had wrinkled gray leathery skin. Their heads were bulbous-shaped, almost like a bullet, with slits for mouths and small indentations where their eyes should have been. Instead of hands, they had crake pincers at the ends of their arms, and their legs didn't appear to bend in the usual way. They moved without walking, as though they were floating above the ground, gliding toward the Tom men with an eerie mechanical precision. Hickson and Parker were paralyzed with fear before they could react. The beings were upon them. 2 of the creatures grabbed Hickson, while the third approached Parker. The men couldn't move, couldn't fight back. It was as if their bodies were completely immobilized. Then, in an instant, both men were lifted off the ground, as if they were weightless, and carried toward the craft. Panic surged through their minds as they floated helplessly toward the glowing blue object. Hickson would later describe the sensation as being pulled by an invisible force, like being caught in a powerful current. The beings said nothing. They made no sound. No attempt to communicate. All Hickson and Parker could do was stare in terror as they were brought aboard the craft. Once inside, the men were separated. Hickson was taken to one part of the craft, while Parker was led to another. The interior of the craft was brightly lit, but the light seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if the walls themselves were glowing. The surfaces were smooth and metallic, and there was a sterile, cold feeling to the entire space. Like a laboratory, Hickson was placed on a table, still unable to move. And before he knew it, one of the beings began to examine him. He described the examination as strange and invasive, though not painful. A large football-shaped object hovered above him, scanning his body from head to toe. Hickson could see no instruments, no needles or devices. Yet he had the distinct sense that the beings were studying him, examining every inch of his body. Though he couldn't speak, his mind raced with questions. What were these beings? Why were they doing this? But no answers came. Meanwhile, Parker, who was younger and less experienced with the world, was even more terrified than Hickson, he later described, feeling completely overwhelmed, as if he was on the verge of passing out from fear. Unlike Hickson, who remained calm during the encounter, Parker went into shock. He would later say that the trauma of the event was so intense that he mentally shut down, unable to process what was happening. Like Hickson, he was examined by the beings, but the details of his experience were blurry, as though his mind had felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes. The beings returned the men to the riverbank. They were floated back outside, their feet never touching the ground, until they were gently placed back on the dirt. Near their fishing spot, the craft, still glowing with that soft blue light, hovered for a few moments longer, as if ensuring that the men were safely returned. Then, without warning, it shot into the sky, disappearing in the blink of an eye. The buzzing sound faded into the distance, leaving only silence behind. For several minutes, Hickson and Parker remained where they were, too shaken to move or speak. It was as if the world had shifted beneath their feet. Finally, Hickson broke the silence, telling Parker that they needed to get help. Parker, still in a state of shock, could barely respond, but he nodded in agreement. They gathered their belongings and drove trembling to the local sheriff's office in Pascagoula, where they reported what had just happened. When they arrived, the officers on duty could see that something was very wrong. Both men were pale, visibly shaken, and barely able to speak coherently. Hickson, the more composed of the two, tried to explain what they had experienced. But even as he spoke the words, they sounded impossible. Alien beings, a floating craft, an abduction. The sheriff and his deputies listened politely, but they were skeptical. It all sounded too far-fetched, too bizarre to be real. But the longer they spoke with Hickson and Parker, the more the officers began to sense that these men were not lying. Their fear was genuine, and their descriptions were detailed and consistent to test their credibility. The officers left the two men alone in a room secretly recording their conversation. If this was a hoax, surely the men would let their guard down once they thought they were in private. But instead of conspiring, Hickson and Parker continued to express their confusion and terror. Hickson could be heard telling Parker to keep calm, while Parker, still shaken, expressed his fear of what had happened and what might happen next after hours of questioning. The officers were left with more questions than answers. They decided to take the men's report seriously, and the next morning they contacted the local press. Soon the story exploded. Newspapers and television stations picked up the account of the Pascagoula abduction, and within days, the quiet town of Pascagoula was flooded with reporters, UFO INV investigators, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to hear the story from the men themselves. Despite the intense media attention, Hickson and Parker stuck to their story. They agreed to undergo lie detector tests, which they passed further, adding to the credibility of their account. UFO researchers, intrigued by the details of the encounter, descended on Pascagoula to interview the men and examine the site where the abduction had taken place. Though no physical evidence was found, the consistency of Hickson and Parker's testimonies made the case hard to dismiss for Charles Hickson. The encounter became a defining moment in his life. He spoke openly about the experience for years afterward, giving interviews and lectures on the subject of UFOs and alien abductions. He was convinced that what had happened to him and Parker was real, and he believed that the beings who had abducted them were from another world. Calvin Parker, on the other hand, was far more reluctant to talk about the experience. The trauma of the event had left him emotionally scarred, and for many years he avoided discussing it publicly. He struggled with the attention that the incident had brought, and it wasn't until decades later that he finally began to open up about what had happened in interviews. He described the deep sense of fear and helplessness he had felt during the abduction, as well as the difficulty of coming to terms with something so completely outside the realm of normal human experience. The Pascagoula abduction remains one of the most famous and well-documented UFO encounters in history. Unlike many other abduction cases, which rely on memories recovered through hypnosis or vague accounts, Hickson and Parker's story was immediate, detailed, and consistent. Their willingness to go to the authorities, undergo lie detector tests, and speak openly about their experience added to the credibility of their claims. Skeptics, of course, have offered alternative explanations. Some suggest that the men may have been hallucinating or experiencing a shared delusion. Others believe that the story was an elaborate hoax, though Hickson and Parker gained little from the experience other than unwanted attention. Despite the skepticism, no one has been able to definitively disprove their account, and the Pascagoula abduction remains a mystery to this day. Whatever the truth may be, the events of that October night along the Pascagoula River left a lasting impact on the two men who lived through it, for Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. Their encounter with the unknown was real, and the Travis Walton abduction. It was the evening of November 5, 1975, and a group of 7 loggers were making their way home after a long day of work, deep in the forest near Snowflake, Arizona. The men, who were rugged and accustomed to the tough physical labor of logging, were tired but satisfied as they drove down the dirt road in their pickup truck. Travis Walton, a 22-year-old, was among them, riding in the front seat, beside his friend and crew boss, Mike Rogers. Little did they know their drive home that evening would lead to one of the most famous and mysterious alien abduction cases in history, a story that would capture the world's attention and inspire the 1993 film Fire in the Sky. As the truck bounced along the dirt road, the men chatted casually, the sky growing darker with each passing minute. The remote Arizona woods were still with only the hum of the truck's engine breaking the silence. Then, out of nowhere, something unusual caught their attention. A bright light appeared in the distance, shining through the trees. At first they thought it might have been a plane or perhaps a helicopter, but as they got closer, it became clear that this was something entirely different. The light grew brighter as they neared a clearing, and soon the men could see the source of the illumination. A large glowing object hovering just above the forest floor. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. The craft was disc-shaped metallic and emitting a brilliant light that lit up the surrounding trees. It hovered silently without any visible means of support or propulsion. The men stopped the truck, staring in disbelief at the strange object before them. Some of them, including Mike, felt an immediate sense of unease and urged the others to stay inside the vehicle. But Travis Walton, drawn by curiosity and a sense of adventure, stepped out of the truck to get a closer look against the protests of his co-workers. He began walking toward the craft. The air around the object felt charged, almost electric, as if something powerful was radiating from it. Travis, standing directly beneath the craft, looked up, and all the others, still in the truck, shouted at him to come back. But before anyone could react, a beam of light shot down from the craft, striking Travis square in the chest. His body was lifted off the ground and thrown several feet back, with a force so powerful that it left his co-workers in shock. Travis hit the ground, motionless. Panic set in. The men, terrified by what they had just witnessed, drove off in a frenzy, leaving Travis behind. It was an instinctive reaction fueled by fear and disbelief. They sped down the road, hearts pounding, unsure of what to do after a few minutes. However, guilt set in. Mike, torn between his responsibility as the crew leader and his fear of what had just happened, made the decision to turn the truck around and go back for Travis when they returned to the clearing. The craft and Travis were gone. The men searched the area frantically, calling out Travis's name, but there was no sign of him. The craft had vanished, leaving no trace behind. It was as if Travis had simply disappeared into thin air. Desperate and frightened, the men returned to town and went straight to the local authorities to report what had happened. The sheriff's office in Snowflake was understandably skeptical. At first, a group of loggers claiming that their friend had been abducted by a UFO. It sounded like the stuff of science fiction, but when the men arrived at the station, they were clearly shaken. Some of them were visibly trembling, and all of them insisted that they were telling the truth. Sheriff Marlon Gillespie and his deputies took down their statements, but doubt lingered. Could this be an elaborate hoax, a cover-up for an accident? The next morning, a search party was organized. Local law enforcement, along with volunteers and the remaining loggers, combed the woods near the site where Travis had disappeared. They searched for any sign of him, footprints, clothing, or perhaps a body, but found nothing. The forest was quiet, and there were no indications that anyone had been there for the next 5 days. The search continued, but Travis was nowhere to be found. The authorities began to suspect foul play. Some believed that the loggers had concocted the UFO story to cover up an accident, or worse, a crime back in town. The story of Travis Walton's disappearance spread like wildfire. Reporters from around the country descended on Snowflake, eager to get the details of what was quickly becoming one of the most mysterious disappearances in recent memory. The loggers were subjected to intense scrutiny, with many accusing them of either lying or being responsible for Travis's vanishing. In an attempt to clear their names, the men agreed to take polygraph tests. The results were stunning, all of them, except one who was deemed inconclusive due to stress, passed the tests, indicating that they believed they were telling the truth about what had happened in the forest that night, and many in the community began to lose hope that he would ever be found. But then, on the 5th day after his disappearance, something remarkable happened. Late at night, a phone call came into Travis's brother's house. On the other end of the line was Travis Walton, his voice weak and confused. He claimed to have no idea where he had been for the past 5 days, but said he had woken up on the side of a road several miles from town. His brother and some friends immediately went to pick him up and found Travis disoriented, dehydrated, and deeply shaken. When Travis was brought back home, the questions began: where had he been? What had happened to him? At first, his memories were foggy, as if he were trying to piece together fragments of a dream. But over the next few days, Travis began to recall the details of his experience, an experience that would cement his place in UFO law forever. According to Travis, after he was struck by the beam of light, he lost consciousness when he awoke. He found himself lying on a table in a strange, brightly lit room. His first thought was that he had been taken to a hospital, but as his vision cleared, he realized that something was terribly wrong. Standing around him were several small beings, about 4 feet tall, with large bald heads, huge black eyes, and thin, frail bodies. They were dressed in tight-fitting metallic suits, and their skin was a pale grayish white. Travis was overcome with fear. He tried to move, but found that his body was weak, as if he had been drugged. The beings seemed to be studying him, observing him closely. Though they made no sound, terrified, Travis managed to push one of the beings away and stumble off the table. He frantically searched the room for an exit, finally finding a doorway that led into a narrow hallway. As he made his way through the craft, he encountered more of the strange, sterile environment, smooth metallic walls, bright, unnatural light, and an eerie silence that seemed to permeate the entire space. He eventually came upon another room, and inside he found a chair with strange controls, desperate for any way to escape. Travis approached the chair, but before he could figure out what the controls did, he was confronted by a different kind of being. This one humanoid, but taller, with strikingly human features. The humanoid figure, dressed in what looked like a blue jumpsuit, led him through the craft without speaking. Travis was taken to another area where he encountered more of these humanoid beings, all of whom appeared calm and non-threatening, yet somehow detached and emotionless. He described them as being almost human, but with subtle differences, unsettling yet familiar. They placed a mask over his face, and almost instantly he lost consciousness again. The next thing Travis remembered was waking up on the side of the road, disoriented and confused. 5 days had passed, but to him it felt like no more than a few hours. He had no idea where he had been during those lost days, only that something extraordinary had happened to him. Travis's account of being taken aboard an alien craft was met with a mixture of awe and skepticism. To his family and friends, the fact that he had returned at all was a miracle, but many others doubted his story. Was it possible that he had been hallucinating, or could the entire incident have been a hoax? Some speculated that Travis had staged his disappearance for publicity, but those who knew him best insisted that he was telling the truth. Over the years, Travis Walton's story has remained one of the most famous and well-documented alien abduction cases. His experience, detailed in his book, The Walton Experience, served as the basis for the 1993 film Fire in the Sky, which dramatized the events of his abduction. While some aspects of the film were sensationalized, the core of Travis's account, his abduction, the craft, and his encounters with strange beings remains unchanged. Skeptics have continued to question the validity of Travis's story. Some suggest that the entire incident was fabricated, pointing to the lack of physical evidence and the possibility of suggestive memories. Others believe that Travis may have experienced a form of altered consciousness, or psych-occult trauma, that led him to believe he had been abducted. However, Travis Walton and his co-workers, who witnessed his initial disappearance, have consistently stood by their story. The fact that the men passed polygraph tests and have remained unwavering in their accounts for decades has convinced many that something truly extraordinary happened in the woods near Snowflake that night. Whether you believe in the possibility of extraterrestrial encounters or not, the Travis Walton abduction remains a captivating and mysterious chapter in the history of UFO phenomena. It is a story of fear, wonder, and the unknown, a reminder that there are still things in this universe that defy explanation. The Broad Haven UFO flap. It was the winter of 1977, and the small rural town of Broad Haven, nestled in the quiet countryside, become the focal point of one of the most famous and perplexing UFO flaps in the United Kingdom. Over the course of several months, strange sightings of unidentified flying objects, unusual lights in the sky, and mysterious humanoid figures would leave the local community baffled and unsettled. What began as a curious encounter at a local school soon escalated into a series of sightings that would attract national attention and spark debate about the nature of these strange occurrences. Broad Haven was a peaceful place where life moved slowly and residents were closely knit. It wasn't the kind of town where anything extraordinary usually happened, but that all changed on February 4th, 1977, when a group of school children from Broad Haven Primary School claimed to have seen something strange near their playground. It was lunchtime, and as the children played outside, several of them noticed an unusual object in a field adjacent to the school. The object was metallic oval-shaped and appeared to be hovering just above the ground. At first, they thought it might have been a helicopter, but there was something different about it. No rotors, no sound, and no movement like a typical aircraft. The object just hovered there, motionless and silent. As the children stared in disbelief, some of them claimed to see figures near the craft, tall humanoid beings dressed in what appeared to be silver suits. These figures moved slowly and deliberately, though they remained at a distance, as if they were observing the children from afar. The sight of these strange beings left the children both frightened and excited. It wasn't every day that they saw something so out of the ordinary. In their quiet town, the children ran back inside the school, breathless and wide-eyed, to tell their teachers what they had seen. At first, the teachers were skeptical. After all, kids had wild imaginations, and it wasn't uncommon for them to make up stories. But as more and more of the children described the same object, the same metallic craft, and the same strange figures, the teachers began to wonder if there was something more to the story. The headmaster of the school decided to take a closer look. He ventured out to the field, where the children said they had seen the craft, but by the time he arrived, there was nothing there. The field was empty with no sign of any disturbance or landing. The headmaster dismissed the incident as a misunderstanding, but the children remained adamant about what they had seen. To prove they weren't making it up, they were asked to draw pictures of the object, and the figures, remarkably, the drawings were strikingly similar, with all the children depicting an oval-shaped craft and tall silver-suited figures. Word of the sighting spread quickly through Broad Haven, and soon local residents were buzzing with speculation. Some believed the children's story, convinced that they had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Others were more skeptical, chalking it up to youthful imagination or a prank. But the mystery didn't end with the schoolyard sighting. Over the next several months, more and more people began reporting strange phenomena in and around Broad Haven. One of the most notable witnesses was a local businessman named David Davies, who had been following the school children's story with interest a few days after the initial sighting. Davies was walking near the same field when he noticed a strange object hovering in the distance. It was metallic and oval-shaped, just as the children had described, and it seemed to move silently through the air like the children Davies was struck by how quiet and smooth the object was. There was no engine noise, no propellers, nothing to suggest it was a conventional aircraft. Intrigued Davies tried to get a closer look, but the object moved away before he could approach it. He returned home shaken, but convinced that there was something unusual happening in Brohaven. He wasn't alone over the next few weeks. More residents came forward with similar stories, accounts of strange objects in the sky, unexplained lights, and even encounters with strange humanoid figures. One local farmer reported seeing a craft land in one of his fields. Late at night, he described the object as being shaped like a cigar, with bright lights emanating from its surface. As he watched from a distance, he saw several figures emerge from the craft. Tall, slender beings dressed in silver suits. They moved around the craft for several minutes before disappearing back inside the craft, then lifted off the ground and shot into the sky with incredible speed. Another family living near the town claimed to have been awoken in the middle of the night by a bright light shining through their window. When they looked outside, they saw a glowing object hovering just above their barn. The object was round and emitted a soft hum. It hovered for a few moments before shooting off into the night sky, leaving the family bewildered and frightened as the sightings continued. The story, and soon, Broadhaven was at the center of a national conversation about UFOs, and extraterrestrial life newspapers ran headlines about the Welsh Triangle, comparing the sightings to the famous Bermuda Triangle, and UFO researchers flocked to the area to investigate one of the most perplexing aspects of the Broadhaven UFO flap was the consistency of the reports. The descriptions of the object's metallic oval or cigar-shaped, often with bright lights, were remarkably similar, as were the accounts of the humanoid figures dressed in silver suits. The fact that so many witnesses, including school children, farmers, and local business people, had independently reported seeing the same things added a layer of credibility to the claims. But as the sightings continued, so too did the speculation: was this truly evidence of extraterrestrial visitors, or was there a more earthly explanation? Some skeptics suggested that the sightings might have been the result of military activity in the area. There were rumors that the British government had been conducting secret experiments with advanced aircraft, and that the strange objects seen in Broadhaven were part of these covert operations. One theory was that the objects were advanced helicopters or drones being tested by the military. The silver-suited figures, according to this theory, were pilots in protective gear, and the strange lights and hovering craft were simply misunderstood by the residents. However, no official explanation was ever given by the government, and the Ministry of Defense, when questioned, denied any involvement in the sightings for the people of Broadhaven. The military explanation seemed inadequate. The objects they had seen didn't behave like any known aircraft. There was no sound, no visible ang, and the way the objects moved, often silently and at incredible speeds, defied conventional physics. Many of the witnesses believed that what they had encountered was not of this earth. As the months went on, the sightings eventually tapered off, but the mystery remained by the summer of 1977. The activity in Broadhaven had largely come to an end, but the impact of the sightings lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed them. The school children, now young adults, continued to stand by their story, insisting that what they had seen that day on the playground was real. David Davies, too, remained convinced that he had encountered something otherworldly during his walk near the fields. Over the years, the Broadhaven UFO flap has been the subject of numerous investigations, documentaries, and books. UFO researchers continue to point to the consistency of the sightings and the credibility of the witnesses as evidence that something truly extraordinary occurred in the small Welsh town in 1977, Despite decades of debate and speculation, no definitive explanation has ever been provided for the sightings, and the Broadhaven UFO flap remains one of the most famous and well-documented UFO events in the UK. For those who experienced it firsthand, the mystery of Broadhaven is not just a strange chapter in the town's history. It is a reminder that there are still things in this world, and perhaps beyond it, that we do not fully understand, whether the sightings were the result of secret government experiments or visitors from another planet. The events of 1977 left an indelible mark on the town and its residents to this day. The fields and skies of Broadhaven hold their secrets. And the question lingers: what did the people of this quiet Welsh village witness all those years ago? Was it a glimpse into a larger cosmic mystery, or simply a cast of misinterpreted earthly phenomena? The truth remains elusive, hidden behind the fog of speculation and the passage of time. But for those who were there, for the children who saw the silver-suited figures near their playground, for the farmers who watched strange lights dance above their fields, the memory of those strange, silent visitors from the sky will never fade. How was the story? Please subscribe and drop a review in comment.